In the heart of ancient Mexico, a civilization flourished, one so vibrant and powerful that its stories still echo across time. This was the world of the Aztecs, a people whose lives were as rich and complex as the land they inhabited. The Aztecs didn't just live, they thrived, building a society that stood tall in the history of humanity. The Aztecs created a world where every aspect of life was intricately connected. Their cities were more than just places to live, they were masterpieces, meticulously planned and built with an eye for beauty and functionality. Tenochtitlan, the beating heart of the Aztec Empire, stood as a testament to their ingenuity and vision. Situated on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, Tenochtitlan was a city that seemed to float on water, its shining temples and bustling markets reflecting in the lake's surface like a vision from a dream. Tenochtitlan wasn't just the capital, it was the soul of the empire. It was where the emperor ruled, where the gods were worshipped, and where the pulse of Aztec life was strongest. The city was a marvel, connected to the mainland by wide causeways that stretched across the water, like arms reaching out to embrace the surrounding lands. The streets were clean, and canals crisscrossed the city, serving as highways for canoes that carried goods and people through the city's heart. Gardens bloomed with every kind of flower, their colors and scents filling the air, creating an environment that felt almost otherworldly in its beauty. In Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs built their temples, towering structures that touched the sky, as if trying to bridge the gap between the heavens and the earth. These temples were more than just buildings, they were sacred spaces where the Aztecs connected with their gods. The most important of these was the Templo Mayor, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. The Templo Mayor dominated the city's skyline, its massive steps leading up to altars where rituals were performed and offerings were made to ensure the balance of the world. The Aztecs believed that their gods had created the world through great sacrifice, and in return, they had to offer their own sacrifices to keep the universe in balance. This belief was at the core of their religion, a powerful force that influenced every aspect of their lives. The priests, who acted as intermediaries between the people and the gods, were among the most respected members of society. They performed ceremonies and sacrifices, their roles crucial in maintaining the harmony of the world. It was a solemn responsibility, one that weighed heavily on the shoulders of those who bore it. The social structure of the Aztec society was as layered and intricate as their religion. At the top was the emperor, known as the Huitzilopochtli, who was seen not just as a ruler but as a divine figure, chosen by the gods to lead the people. The emperor's power was immense, but it wasn't absolute. He was advised by a council of nobles, who helped govern the empire's vast territories. These nobles were the elite, ruling over the land and its people, and their wealth and influence were second only to the emperor himself. Below the nobles were the commoners, who made up the majority of the population. They were farmers, craftsmen, and traders, whose hard work kept the empire thriving. The farmers cultivated the land, growing crops like maize, beans, and squash, which formed the staple diet of the Aztec people. They used advanced agricultural techniques, such as chinampas, artificial islands built on the lake, to maximize their harvests. These floating gardens were a marvel of engineering, allowing the Aztecs to feed their growing population in a land where arable land was scarce. The craftsmen and traders were also vital to the empire's prosperity. The craftsmen were skilled in various trades, creating everything from pottery and textiles to elaborate featherwork and jewelry. Their work was highly valued, and some of the finest pieces were reserved for the nobility or offered to the gods. The traders, known as Paktika, traveled far and wide, bringing goods from distant lands back to Tenochtitlan. They were more than just merchants, they were also spies and ambassadors, gathering intelligence and forging alliances on behalf of the emperor. Even within the commoner class, there were layers of status. Some commoners owned land, while others worked on the lands of the nobles. There were also slaves, who were at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Slavery in Aztec society was different from the harsh systems seen in other parts of the world. It was often a temporary condition, and slaves could earn their freedom. Some were prisoners of war, while others became slaves due to debts or as punishment for crimes. Despite their low status, slaves had certain rights and were an integral part of the society. The Aztec world was a place of contrasts, where beauty and brutality coexisted in a delicate balance. Their society was one of the most sophisticated of its time, with achievements in agriculture, art, and engineering that were unmatched in the Americas. Yet, it was also a world where the gods demanded blood, and human sacrifice was a necessary part of maintaining the cosmic order. The Aztecs didn't see this as cruelty, but as a sacred duty, a way to repay the gods for the gift of life. Tenochtitlan was the embodiment of all that the Aztecs valued: strength, beauty, order, and devotion. Its markets were filled with goods from across the empire, its temples resonated with the prayers of its people, and its streets bustled with the energy of a society at the height of its power. But beneath the surface of this great city, there was always an undercurrent of tension, a sense that the world was fragile, and that it could all come crashing down if the balance was disturbed. In the shadow of its great temples, the Aztecs lived their lives, always aware of the thin line that separated order from chaos. They knew that their gods were powerful, but they also knew that they were capricious, and that the favor of the gods could turn to wrath in an instant. It was this awareness that shaped the Aztec world, driving them to build, to create, to sacrifice, and to pray, always striving to keep the delicate balance that held their world together. The air was thick with anticipation. The streets of Tenochtitlan buzzed with life as the people prepared for one of the most important events of the year, the Toxcatl Festival. This was not just any celebration, it was a time when the Aztecs would come together to honor their gods, to show their devotion, and to ensure that the balance of the universe remained intact. The festival was a reflection of the very heart of Aztec belief, a moment when the boundary between the mortal world and the divine seemed to blur. The Toxcatl Festival was dedicated to Tezcatlipoca, the god of darkness, sorcery, and destiny. He was one of the most feared and revered deities in the Aztec pantheon, known as the smoking mirror for the obsidian mirror he carried, which was said to reveal the fates of men. Tezcatlipoca was a complex god, embodying both creation and destruction, light and shadow. He was the force behind life's unpredictability, the one who could give and take away with a flick of his hand. To honor Tezcatlipoca was to acknowledge the fragility of existence, to accept that life could change in an instant. The Aztecs understood that the world was a delicate balance, and it was their duty to maintain that balance through devotion and sacrifice. The Toxcatl Festival was the epitome of this belief, a ritual that reminded the people of their place in the cosmos and the power of the gods who watched over them. Preparations for the Toxcatl Festival began long before the first day of the celebration. The entire city of Tenochtitlan seemed to pulse with energy as people worked tirelessly to make everything perfect. The temple grounds were cleaned and decorated, the markets filled with offerings, and the altars prepared for the rituals that would take place. The air was filled with the scent of flowers, incense, and fresh-cut wood, mingling together to create an atmosphere that was both sacred and festive. Central to the Toxcatl Festival was the selection of a young man who would represent Tezcatlipoca himself. This man was chosen for his beauty, strength, and grace, and he was treated like a living god for an entire year leading up to the festival. He was dressed in the finest garments, adorned with jewels and feathers, and given everything he could desire. Wherever he went, people bowed in reverence, for in their eyes, he was the earthly embodiment of Tezcatlipoca. For the chosen one, this was both an honor and a heavy burden. He lived in luxury, but he knew that his life was not his own. As the Toxcatl Festival approached, he would take on more of the god's attributes, becoming a symbol of the god's presence on earth. In the final days before the festival, he was given a flute, which he played as he walked through the city, a haunting melody that echoed through the streets, reminding the people of what was to come. The rituals of the Toxcatl Festival were filled with symbolism and meaning. The festival began with dances and songs, offerings of food and flowers, all designed to please the gods and invite their blessings. The people dressed in their finest clothing, their faces painted, their hearts filled with reverence and hope. Every movement, every word, was a prayer, a plea for favor, a hope that Tezcatlipoca would look kindly upon them. But the most poignant moment of the festival came when the chosen one ascended the steps of the temple. He was no longer just a man, he had become a living symbol, a bridge between the human and the divine. The crowd watched in silence as he walked, each step a reminder of the sacrifice that was about to be made. The air was thick with tension, with sorrow, and with a strange sense of peace, as if everyone knew that this was the way things had to be. At the top of the temple, the Chosen One stood before the altar, his flute now silent. He looked out over the city, his eyes taking in the sights of the world he would soon leave behind. There was no fear in his gaze, only acceptance. He knew that his life was a gift to the god, that his death would help to maintain the balance of the world. And so, with a steady hand, he laid himself upon the altar, offering his life in the name of Tezcatlipoca. The priests, dressed in their ceremonial robes, surrounded the altar. Their faces were solemn, their hands steady as they prepared for the final act of the ritual. They raised their knives, their voices chanting prayers to the god, asking for his blessing, for his protection, for his continued favor. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the sacrifice was made. The Chosen One's heart, still beating, was lifted high into the air, offered to Tezcatlipoca as a symbol of the people's devotion. The crowd below watched in silence, their eyes filled with tears, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. But there was also a sense of relief, of release, as if they knew that the god had been appeased, that their world would continue to turn for another year. As the sun set on the day of the Toxcatl festival, the city of Tenochtitlan was filled with a quiet reverence. The people returned to their homes, their minds filled with the events of the day, their hearts filled with the knowledge that they had done what was necessary to maintain the balance of the world. The gods had been honored, the rituals had been performed, and life would go on. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of unease, a sense that something had shifted, that the world was not as stable as it once was. The Toxcatl festival had always been a time of reflection, of remembering that life was fragile and that the favor of the gods could never be taken for granted. But this year, the festival felt different, as if the balance had been disturbed, as if something dark was on the horizon. The people of Tenochtitlan didn't know it yet, but the Toxcatl festival would be remembered not just as a celebration of their god, but as the beginning of the end for their great empire. The rituals had been performed, the sacrifice had been made, but the forces of change were already at work, and soon, the world they knew would be torn apart in ways they could never have imagined. The first time they saw the ships, the Aztecs could hardly believe their eyes. Floating on the horizon, these massive wooden structures seemed like mountains on the sea, moving steadily toward the shore. The people of the coast watched in silence, their hearts pounding with a mixture of awe and fear. They had never seen anything like this before, and in that moment, a sense of foreboding settled over the land. When the strangers finally came ashore, they were unlike anyone the Aztecs had ever encountered. Their skin was pale, their armor gleamed in the sunlight, and they carried weapons that shone with a deadly promise. These were the men led by Hernán Cortés, a man driven by ambition, curiosity, and a hunger for power. Cortés was no ordinary man. He was a conquistador, a soldier of fortune, whose eyes gleamed with the fire of conquest. Cortés had heard stories of a great empire in the land of the Mexica, a place of untold riches and power. Gold, silver, and precious stones, these were the treasures that whispered to him in his dreams, drawing him across the ocean to this strange new world. But Cortés was not just seeking wealth, he sought glory, the kind of glory that would etch his name into the annals of history. He knew that to achieve this, he would need to face the greatest challenge of his life, the mighty Aztec Empire. The first encounters between Cortés and the Aztecs were filled with tension and uncertainty. The Aztecs, under the rule of Emperor Montezuma, had heard of these strange visitors from the sea. Stories spread through the empire like wildfire, tales of men with skin like the moon, riding beasts as tall as houses, wielding weapons that could unleash thunder and lightning. Some believed these men were gods, sent by Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity who was prophesied to return. Cortés, ever the cunning strategist, played into these fears and beliefs. He presented himself as a friend, a bringer of gifts and goodwill, all the while hiding his true intentions. The Aztecs, though wary, extended their hospitality, offering food, shelter, and gifts to these strange visitors. But beneath the surface, there was an unease that neither side could shake. The Aztecs were proud, powerful, and deeply tied to their land and gods, while the Spanish were driven by an insatiable desire for conquest and control. Montezuma, the emperor of the Aztecs, was caught in a web of doubt and indecision. He was a man who carried the weight of an entire empire on his shoulders, and the arrival of the Spanish put him in an impossible position. He knew that these strangers were dangerous, but he was also curious, unsure of what their presence meant. Was this the return of Quetzalcoatl? Were these men gods or just mortals with strange powers? The uncertainty gnawed at him, leaving him paralyzed, unable to act decisively. As Cortés and his men made their way toward Tenochtitlan, the tension grew. The Aztecs watched their every move, trying to understand these newcomers who spoke in strange tongues and worshipped unfamiliar gods. Cortés, for his part, was constantly calculating, assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the Aztecs. He knew that if he was to conquer this vast empire, he would need allies, and he would need to exploit every advantage he could find. The uneasy alliance between the Spanish and the Aztecs was built on a foundation of lies, mistrust, and fear. Cortés promised friendship, but in his heart, he was already planning how to bring the mighty Aztec Empire to its knees. The Aztecs, for their part, accepted the Spanish into their world, but they never fully trusted them. They offered gifts, performed rituals, and showed respect, but always with an eye on these strange men who had come from across the sea. Cortés was relentless. He knew that his men were few, and that they were surrounded by a civilization that outnumbered them many times over. But he also knew that the Aztecs were divided, that there were enemies within their own ranks who could be turned to his side. He played on the fears and rivalries of the Aztecs, forging alliances with those who were dissatisfied with Montezuma's rule. These alliances would prove crucial in the battles to come, as the Spanish and their native allies prepared to face the full might of the Aztec Empire. The march to Tenochtitlan was like a journey into the heart of a storm. The Spanish, with their steel armor and horses, cut an imposing figure, but they were always aware of the eyes that watched them from the shadows. The Aztecs were everywhere, their presence felt even when they couldn't be seen. The land itself seemed to hum with tension, as if it knew that something terrible was about to happen. When Cortés and his men finally reached the great city of Tenochtitlan, they were struck by its beauty and grandeur. The city rose out of the lake like a jewel, its temples and palaces shining in the sunlight. But beneath the surface, there was a sense of unease, a feeling that this paradise was built on a foundation that could crumble at any moment. Cortés was welcomed into the city with great ceremony. Montezuma, resplendent in his royal regalia, greeted the Spanish with gifts of gold and precious stones. But behind the smiles and the polite words, there was a tension that crackled in the air. Cortés knew that he was walking a fine line, that any misstep could lead to disaster. The Aztecs, for their part, watched the Spanish with a mixture of fear, fascination, and growing anger. The alliance between the Spanish and the Aztecs was like a fragile glass, beautiful but brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Every word, every gesture was weighed, as both sides tried to figure out the true intentions of the other. The Spanish were outsiders in a world they didn't fully understand, and the Aztecs were proud, fierce, and determined to protect their way of life. As the days passed, the tension between the two sides grew, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for a spark to ignite the inevitable conflict. Cortés knew that time was running out. He needed to act, to strike before the Aztecs could fully realize the danger they were in. And so, he continued to plot, to manipulate, to prepare for the moment when he would finally make his move. The Aztecs, too, sensed that something was wrong. They had welcomed these strangers into their city, but now they were beginning to see them for what they truly were, conquerors, men who would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. The uneasy alliance was reaching its breaking point, and when it finally shattered, the consequences would be devastating for both sides. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, as the sun set over the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco, a storm was brewing, one that would soon engulf the entire empire in a struggle for survival. The arrival of the Spanish conquistadors marked the beginning of the end for the Aztec civilization, a tragic tale of betrayal, bloodshed, and the clash of two worlds that could never truly understand one another. Montezuma stood on the terrace of his palace, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky with hues of orange and red. The city of Tenochtitlan spread out before him, a vast and vibrant tapestry of life, but in his heart, a storm was brewing. The arrival of the Spanish had shaken him in ways he could not fully express. They were unlike anything he had ever known, and their presence weighed heavily on his soul. From the moment he first heard of the strangers who had arrived on the coast, Montezuma had been gripped by a profound unease. The prophecies, the omens, everything seemed to point to this moment. Could these men be the gods returning, as foretold? Or were they harbingers of something far darker? He didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at him, day and night. When Cortés and his men entered Tenochtitlan, Montezuma welcomed them with all the grandeur befitting a ruler of his stature. He adorned them with gifts of gold and precious stones, offerings meant to appease, to honor, to buy time. But beneath the lavish ceremonies and the polite words, Montezuma was a man torn by doubt and fear. He walked a tightrope between his duty as emperor and the dread that these strangers would bring ruin to everything he held dear. The relationship between Montezuma and the Spanish was fraught with tension from the start. Cortés, ever the cunning strategist, treated Montezuma with a respect that was laced with hidden contempt. He saw the emperor not as a powerful ruler, but as an obstacle to be overcome, a pawn in his quest for glory and riches. Montezuma, on the other hand, struggled to understand the intentions of these pale-skinned men who seemed to embody both fascination and terror. Cultural misunderstandings only deepened the divide between them. The Spanish viewed the Aztecs' rituals, their gods, and their way of life with disdain, branding them as barbaric and pagan. They could not comprehend the depth of the Aztecs' connection to their gods, the sacredness of their rituals, or the complexity of their beliefs. To them, Montezuma's empire was something to be conquered, its riches to be taken, its people to be subdued. For Montezuma, the Spanish were a mystery wrapped in armor, their motivations obscured by a language he did not speak and a religion he did not understand. He saw in Cortés a man driven by an insatiable hunger, but he could not see into the depths of the conquistador's soul. All he knew was that these men were dangerous, that they had brought with them forces that could not be easily controlled. The tension between the two cultures was palpable, a silent battle fought with glances, gestures, and unspoken words. The Spanish, with their guns and horses, their crosses and strange prayers, were like a shadow over Tenochtitlan, a presence that grew heavier with each passing day. The Aztecs, proud and strong, were wary, their spirits bruised but not yet broken. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. Montezuma's decision to allow the Spanish to stay in Tenochtitlan was a moment of profound consequence. It was a decision born of fear, of uncertainty, of a desperate hope that perhaps, somehow, peace could be maintained. He believed, or perhaps wanted to believe, that by showing kindness, by extending hospitality, he could prevent the unthinkable. But in his heart, he knew that the balance was precarious, that one wrong move could send everything tumbling into chaos. The people of Tenochtitlan looked to their emperor for guidance, for strength, but they too were filled with unease. The presence of the Spanish in their sacred city was an affront to everything they held sacred. Whispers spread through the streets, voices filled with doubt, with anger, with fear. Why were these strangers allowed to stay? What did it mean for the future of their empire? The air was thick with tension, a tension that could not be easily dispelled. For Montezuma, each day the Spanish remained was a day of growing torment. He saw the way Cortés moved through his city, the way his men took what they wanted, their eyes gleaming with greed. He heard the whispers of his people, the murmurs of discontent, and he knew that the time for action was slipping away. Yet he hesitated, caught between the fear of what might happen if he acted and the dread of what would happen if he did not. The uneasy truce between Montezuma and the Spanish was like a rope stretched to its breaking point, fraying with every passing moment. The tension was unbearable, a constant presence that loomed over every interaction, every decision. Montezuma was a man trapped by circumstances beyond his control, his once unshakable confidence now eroded by the weight of his doubts. As the days passed, the situation grew more volatile. The Spanish, emboldened by their success, pushed further, testing the limits of Montezuma's patience, of his power. And Montezuma, torn between his duty to his people and his fear of the consequences, found himself increasingly isolated, his once loyal advisors now questioning his decisions, his leadership. The relationship between Montezuma and the Spanish was a tragic dance, a slow-motion descent into inevitable disaster. Each step brought them closer to the point of no return, each decision a gamble with the fate of an empire hanging in the balance. Montezuma, once a ruler of unrivaled power and respect, now stood on the edge of an abyss, his every move shadowed by the specter of betrayal, of ruin. The city of Tenochtitlan, once the jewel of the Aztec Empire, was now a place of uncertainty, of fear. The people sensed the shifting winds, the change that was coming, and they braced themselves for what they knew would be a storm unlike any they had ever faced. The Spanish were still outsiders, still unfamiliar, but their presence had become a part of the city's fabric, a thread that was slowly unraveling the very essence of what Tenochtitlan had once been. Montezuma, standing alone in his palace, could feel the weight of the empire pressing down on him. He was a man who had lost control of his destiny, a ruler who had been forced to confront his own limitations, his own mortality. The Spanish were a force he could not fully understand, could not fully contain, and the realization of this fact haunted him, day and night. In allowing the Spanish to stay, Montezuma had hoped to maintain peace, to avoid bloodshed. But in doing so, he had set the stage for a tragedy that would soon engulf his empire, a tragedy that would be remembered for generations as a moment of profound sorrow, of lost glory, of an empire brought to its knees. The city of Tenochtitlan was alive with anticipation as the festival of Toxcatl began. The air was thick with the scent of incense and flowers, mingling with the sounds of drums and flutes that echoed through the streets. It was a time of joy, a time when the people came together to honor their gods, to celebrate life, and to give thanks for the blessings they had received. The sky above was a brilliant blue, and the sun bathed the city in a golden light that made the stone temples and palaces gleam like treasures. The people moved through the streets in colorful garments, their faces painted with vibrant hues, their hearts filled with reverence and pride. This was their time, their moment to connect with the divine, to feel the presence of their gods among them. Everywhere, there was a sense of purpose, a rhythm that guided the people as they prepared for the sacred rituals. The plazas were adorned with flowers, their petals forming intricate patterns that seemed to dance in the light. Offerings were carefully arranged, gifts to the gods who watched over them, who had given them life, and who could take it away just as easily. The city was a living altar, every stone, every building a testament to the people's devotion. At the heart of the city stood the great temple, a towering structure that reached up toward the heavens. It was here, in this sacred place, that the most important rituals of the Toxcatl festival would take place. The temple was more than just a building, it was the very center of the Aztec world, a place where the earth and sky met, where the gods themselves could be touched. The priests, clad in their ceremonial robes, moved with a solemn grace as they prepared for the rituals. Their faces were calm, but their eyes shone with the intensity of their faith. They had spent years learning the sacred rites, the prayers and chants that would call the gods to their side. Every gesture, every word was filled with meaning, each step a dance between the mortal and the divine. As the festival began, the people gathered in the plazas, their voices rising in songs of praise and thanksgiving. The drums beat out a steady rhythm, their sound like the heartbeat of the earth itself, a pulse that connected every man, woman, and child to the world around them. The flutes sang out like the voices of the gods, their melodies weaving through the air, lifting the spirits of all who heard them. The rituals were a sight to behold, a powerful reminder of the connection between the Aztecs and their gods. The priests led the ceremonies, their voices chanting ancient prayers that had been passed down through generations. The people joined in, their voices rising together in a chorus that echoed off the temple walls, a sound that seemed to reach up to the heavens. One of the most sacred moments of the festival was the offering of the Xiptla, a chosen individual who had lived as the god Tezcatlipoca for a year. He had been treated as a living god, honored and revered by all. Now, as the festival reached its climax, he would give his life to ensure the continued favor of the gods. The people watched with a mix of awe and sorrow, knowing that his sacrifice was necessary, that it was a gift to the gods who had given them so much. The temple stood as the backdrop to these rituals, its steps covered in flowers, its altars prepared for the sacred offerings. The priests moved with precision, their hands steady as they performed the rites that would honor the gods and bring blessings to the people. Every movement was a prayer, every breath a plea for mercy, for protection, for life. As the day wore on, the celebrations continued. The people danced in the plazas, their movements a reflection of the joy they felt in their hearts. They sang songs that told of the gods' greatness, of the creation of the world, of the battles fought and won in the name of their deities. The air was filled with laughter and song, the sounds of a people who knew their place in the world, who understood the delicate balance between life and death, between the mortal and the divine. But beneath the surface, there was a tension that could not be ignored. The Spanish, those strange outsiders who had been allowed into the city, watched the rituals with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. They did not understand the significance of the festival, the deep connection between the Aztecs and their gods. To them, these rituals were nothing more than pagan rites, the actions of a people who had yet to be brought into the light of their own faith. The Aztecs, however, knew better. They knew that the Toxcatl festival was more than just a celebration, it was a lifeline, a connection to the gods who controlled their fate. Every year, they gathered to honor Tezcatlipoca, the god of the night sky, the god who could bring prosperity or ruin. They danced, they sang, they offered up their prayers, knowing that in doing so, they were ensuring the survival of their world. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the city, the atmosphere grew more intense. The rituals took on a more solemn tone, the laughter and joy giving way to quiet reflection. The people knelt before the altars, their heads bowed in reverence, their hearts heavy with the weight of what was to come. The priests continued their chants, their voices rising and falling like the waves of the lake that surrounded the city. The festival of Toxcatl was a time of renewal, a moment when the Aztecs could reconnect with the forces that governed their world. It was a time of sacrifice, of offering up the best of what they had to ensure the continued favor of the gods. The people understood this, and they accepted it with a grace and dignity that came from centuries of tradition, from a deep and abiding faith in the gods who had shaped their world. As the final rituals of the day were completed, the people of Tenochtitlan looked to the temple, to the priests, and to the sky above. They knew that their fate was in the hands of the gods, and they had done all they could to secure their favor. The festival had begun, the rituals had been performed, and now all they could do was wait, with hope in their hearts and prayers on their lips. The Toxcatl festival was not just a celebration, it was a testament to the strength and resilience of a people who understood that their very existence was a gift from the gods, a gift that could be taken away at any moment. Whispers of fear and mistrust hung heavy in the air as the Spanish soldiers walked the streets of Tenochtitlan. Their eyes darted around, suspicious of every movement, every glance from the Aztec people. The city, once a marvel of beauty and grandeur, now felt like a labyrinth of danger, its vibrant life overshadowed by an invisible threat that gnawed at the hearts of the Spanish. It was during the Toxcatl festival, a time of sacred rituals and celebration, that these fears would begin to boil over, leading to an event that would forever stain the history of both empires. Cortés had left the city, called away by urgent matters, and in his absence, he placed Pedro de Alvarado in command. Alvarado was a man known for his bravery, but also for his impatience and harshness. He was restless, his mind filled with worries about the power and numbers of the Aztecs, and as the days passed, these worries began to twist into something darker. Every beat of the festival drums seemed to him like the countdown to a revolt, every ritual chant like a call to arms. The soldiers, too, felt it, the creeping dread that at any moment, the city could erupt into violence. The festival, which should have been a time of peace and reverence, was now clouded by the unease of the Spanish. They watched the Aztecs with growing suspicion, seeing in their joyous celebrations a hidden malice. The sight of thousands gathered in the temple plazas, their voices lifted in song, their feet moving in time to the music, only fueled their fears. To the Spanish, this was no longer just a festival, it was the perfect cover for an uprising, a moment when the Aztecs could strike and overwhelm them. Alvarado's mind raced with possibilities, his thoughts consumed by the idea that the Aztecs were planning something against them. Cortés had left him with a city full of people who outnumbered his men many times over, and the weight of that responsibility bore down on him like a crushing stone. He had heard the rumors, the talk of warriors preparing in secret, of weapons hidden in the heart of the city, ready to be unleashed at a moment's notice. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that he could not wait for the first blow to fall. He had to act, and he had to act now. But there was no proof, no clear sign that the Aztecs were planning to revolt. All Alvarado had were his fears, his suspicions, and the overwhelming sense that time was running out. The sounds of the festival, the drums, the flutes, the chanting, became a constant reminder of the potential danger. He imagined the Aztecs, emboldened by their gods, turning their rituals into a prelude to an attack. It was this fear, this gnawing terror of what could happen, that drove Alvarado to make a fateful decision. He would strike first. In his mind, it was the only option. He could not risk being caught off guard, could not wait for the Aztecs to move against him and his men. The thought of being overwhelmed, of seeing his comrades slaughtered by an enraged populace, was too much to bear. He reasoned that by striking during the festival, he could break the spirit of the Aztecs, catch them unprepared, and prevent the uprising he was so certain was coming. The plan took shape quickly. Alvarado gathered his men, sharing his fears, convincing them that they were on the brink of disaster unless they acted immediately. The soldiers, already on edge, did not need much convincing. The tension had been building for days, and now it was about to explode. They steeled themselves for what was to come, their minds filled with visions of battle, of bloodshed, of survival. As the festival reached its height, with the people of Tenochtitlan fully immersed in their rituals, Alvarado and his men prepared for the strike. The contrast between the two groups could not have been starker. On one side, a people united in celebration, their hearts full of faith and joy; on the other, soldiers driven by fear, their minds set on violence. The peace of the festival was about to be shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. In those final moments before the attack, a silence fell over the Spanish ranks, a heavy stillness that belied the storm about to be unleashed. Alvarado gave the order, and the soldiers moved with the precision of men who had trained for war, their weapons gleaming in the light of the setting sun. They descended upon the festival with a fury born of desperation, cutting through the crowd with merciless efficiency. The joyous songs of the Aztecs turned to cries of terror as the massacre began. The drums that had once kept the rhythm of the dance now beat out a frantic, chaotic pulse, echoing the panicked hearts of the people. The temple plaza, which had been a place of celebration and reverence, was now a scene of horror, the air thick with the sounds of screams and the clash of weapons. The blood of the innocent flowed like water, staining the sacred ground. Alvarado and his men showed no mercy. Their fear had transformed into a terrible wrath, one that saw every Aztec as a threat, every movement as an attack. The priests, who had been leading the rituals with such care and devotion, were among the first to fall, their bodies crumpling to the ground as they tried to protect the sanctity of the ceremonies. The people, unarmed and unprepared, had no chance against the onslaught. The massacre was swift, brutal, and total. What had started as a festival of life and renewal ended in death and despair. The Spanish, driven by their fears, had turned a sacred event into a slaughterhouse, their actions forever staining the history of the city. The people of Tenochtitlan, who had gathered to honor their gods, were left to mourn their dead, their voices now silent, their hearts broken. Alvarado, standing amidst the carnage, felt no triumph, no sense of victory. The fear that had driven him to act now mingled with a deep, gnawing guilt. He had acted to prevent an uprising, but in doing so, he had unleashed a wave of death that could never be undone. The consequences of his actions would ripple through the city, through the empire, and through history, leaving behind a legacy of blood and sorrow. In that moment, Tenochtitlan was forever changed. The festival of Toxcatl, once a symbol of unity and faith, had become a symbol of the tragedy that would soon engulf the Aztec Empire. The people, the priests, the soldiers, all were caught in the web of fear and violence, their lives intertwined in a story that would end in the fall of one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever known. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over Tenochtitlan as the festival of Toxcatl reached its peak. The great temple, the heart of the city, was alive with the rhythm of drums and the melodies of flutes, a symphony that filled the air with a sense of reverence and joy. Thousands of Aztecs, their hearts full of devotion, had gathered to honor their gods, unaware that this day, meant for celebration, would end in unimaginable horror. Without warning, the sacred sounds were drowned out by the clatter of armor and the sharp ring of steel. Spanish soldiers, eyes burning with fear and determination, stormed into the temple plaza, their swords raised high. The priests, dressed in their ceremonial robes, barely had time to react before the first blows fell. Blood splattered across the stone steps, staining the flowers that had been laid as offerings. The nobles, who had come to the temple in their finest garments, stood frozen in shock as the carnage unfolded before their eyes. They had always been the keepers of tradition, the leaders in times of peace and war, but now they were helpless, caught in a nightmare that defied reason. One by one, they fell, their cries for mercy drowned out by the relentless screams of the dying. The massacre was swift and merciless. The Spanish, driven by a mixture of fear and a misguided sense of duty, cut down anyone in their path. The priests, who had spent their lives serving the gods, were slaughtered where they stood, their sacred rituals interrupted by the brutal reality of conquest. The nobles, symbols of the Aztec Empire's power and glory, were hunted like animals, their bodies piling up on the temple steps. As the bloodshed continued, the Aztec populace began to realize the full extent of the horror that was unfolding. Panic spread like wildfire through the city. Mothers clutched their children to their chests, trying to shield them from the violence, while fathers scrambled to find weapons to defend their families. The streets, once filled with music and laughter, now echoed with the sounds of terror and chaos. The sacred plaza, which had been a place of worship and unity, was now a scene of unimaginable brutality. The bodies of the fallen lay strewn across the ground, their blood mingling with the offerings meant for the gods. The air, once fragrant with incense, was thick with the stench of death. Those who had come to the temple to seek blessings were instead met with a massacre that left their world shattered. Amidst the chaos, some tried to fight back, grabbing whatever they could find, stones, sticks, anything that could be used as a weapon. But it was no use. The Spanish, armed with steel and driven by fear, were unstoppable. The few who dared to resist were quickly cut down, their bravery rewarded with swift and brutal deaths. The surviving Aztecs could only watch in horror as their leaders, their priests, their very way of life, were destroyed before their eyes. The temple, once a symbol of their connection to the divine, had become a slaughterhouse. The Spanish showed no mercy, their swords slashing through flesh and bone with a terrifying efficiency. The sacred ground was soaked in blood, the life drained from the city's most revered figures. The massacre at the Great Temple was more than just a battle, it was the breaking of a spirit, the destruction of a people's faith in their gods and their leaders. The survivors, those who managed to escape the bloodshed, were left to grapple with the unimaginable loss. Their world, once so full of life and meaning, had been torn apart in a matter of hours. The city that had been the center of their universe was now a place of death and despair. As the last of the screams died away and the Spanish soldiers wiped the blood from their blades, a heavy silence fell over Tenochtitlan. The sun, which had borne witness to the massacre, sank below the horizon, casting the city into darkness. The temple, now a graveyard, stood as a grim reminder of what had been lost. The festival of Toxcatl, meant to honor the gods, had become a day of mourning, a day that would be remembered in sorrow for generations to come. The Aztec people, once so proud and strong, were left broken by the events of that day. The massacre at the Great Temple was not just a physical attack, it was a spiritual one, a blow that struck at the very heart of their civilization. The gods they had worshipped, the leaders they had followed, all seemed distant now, their power diminished in the face of such overwhelming violence. The reactions of the Aztec people were a mix of grief, anger, and disbelief. How could this have happened? How could the gods have allowed such a tragedy? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the survivors struggled to make sense of the devastation around them. Some wept openly, their tears falling on the blood-soaked ground, while others stood in stunned silence, their minds unable to process the enormity of what they had witnessed. As night fell, the city was eerily quiet. The fires that had been lit for the festival flickered weakly, casting ghostly shadows on the temple walls. The survivors huddled together, seeking comfort in each other's presence, but there was no solace to be found. The massacre had left them all wounded, their souls scarred by the violence that had ripped through their lives. The great temple, once the heart of Tenochtitlan, was now a place of death. The priests, who had guided the people in their worship, lay dead alongside the nobles who had led them in battle. The sacred rituals, which had been meant to ensure the favor of the gods, had been interrupted by a slaughter that left the city's future uncertain. In the days that followed, the full horror of the massacre began to sink in. The survivors mourned their dead, their cries of grief echoing through the empty streets. The festival of Toxcatl, which should have been a time of joy and renewal, had become a symbol of loss and despair. The city, once so full of life, was now haunted by the memories of those who had been lost. The massacre at the Great Temple was a turning point, a moment when the world of the Aztecs began to unravel. The bloodshed had not only taken lives, it had taken hope, faith, and the sense of safety that had once defined their existence. The people of Tenochtitlan were left to pick up the pieces, to try and rebuild in the shadow of a tragedy that would never be forgotten. The air in Tenochtitlan was thick with the scent of blood and smoke. The once vibrant city, where life had thrived under the watchful eyes of its gods, now seemed cloaked in a shroud of sorrow and fear. The massacre at the Great Temple had left a scar so deep that it touched every corner of the Aztec capital. The people moved through the streets like shadows, their faces etched with grief, their hearts heavy with the weight of the lives that had been lost. In the immediate aftermath, the city was eerily silent. The bustling markets, usually filled with the sounds of trade and laughter, were quiet. The temples, which had been centers of worship and community, were now places of mourning. The festival of Toxcatl, once a time of joy and renewal, had become a memory drenched in blood. The survivors were left to grapple with a tragedy that seemed too immense to comprehend. Montezuma, the emperor who had once ruled with unquestioned authority, found himself trapped in a nightmare. The massacre had shaken him to his core, leaving him torn between his duty as a leader and the realization that the world he had known was slipping away. He had allowed the Spanish into Tenochtitlan, hoping to find a way to coexist, but now that decision weighed on him like a curse. The news of the massacre reached Montezuma in the early hours after the bloodshed, carried by trembling messengers who could barely find the words to describe what had happened. The emperor's heart sank as he listened, each detail of the atrocity striking him like a blow. The priests, the nobles, the people, all slain in a moment of madness. The temple, the very symbol of their faith, desecrated by foreign hands. Montezuma's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, anger, fear. How could this have happened under his watch? How could he have let the Spanish, these outsiders, wreak such havoc in his city? He had welcomed them, treated them with respect, and now they had repaid his hospitality with violence. The emperor's sorrow was compounded by the knowledge that his people now looked to him for answers, for justice, for a way forward, and he had none to offer. The relationship between the Spanish and the Aztecs, already strained by cultural differences and mutual suspicions, deteriorated rapidly in the wake of the massacre. The trust that Montezuma had tried to build was shattered, replaced by a deep and abiding mistrust. The Spanish, for their part, were on edge, their every move watched with eyes that no longer saw them as guests, but as enemies. The city, which had once been a place of peace, was now a tinderbox, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. Among the Aztecs, the massacre fueled a growing sense of resistance. The people, once united in their reverence for their gods and their loyalty to their emperor, were now united by a common enemy. Whispers of rebellion began to spread through the streets, carried from one person to the next like a flame passed from torch to torch. The pain of loss gave way to anger, and that anger began to turn into a resolve, a determination to fight back, to reclaim what had been taken from them. The warriors of Tenochtitlan, who had been trained from birth to defend their land, felt the sting of humiliation and betrayal. The Spanish had shown their true colors, and now there was no turning back. The nobles, who had survived the massacre, gathered in secret, their faces grim, their voices filled with the quiet fury of men who had seen too much. Plans were made, alliances forged, as the Aztecs prepared to take a stand. Montezuma, caught between his fear of the Spanish and his duty to his people, was paralyzed by indecision. The emperor had always believed that diplomacy could prevail, that there was a way to find peace with these strange visitors from across the sea. But the massacre had changed everything. The people were crying out for justice, for vengeance, and Montezuma knew that his time was running out. The empire he had fought so hard to maintain was slipping through his fingers, and he could feel the weight of his ancestors' disappointment pressing down on him. The city itself seemed to tremble under the tension. Every corner, every alley, every marketplace was alive with the energy of a people pushed to the brink. The Spanish, once viewed with curiosity and perhaps a bit of awe, were now seen as the architects of a great betrayal. The resentment that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks was now boiling over, and it was only a matter of time before it erupted into open conflict. In the homes of Tenochtitlan, families gathered to mourn their dead and to prepare for what was to come. Mothers whispered words of comfort to their children, trying to hide their own fears. Fathers sharpened their weapons, knowing that they might soon be called upon to defend their city. The mood was somber, the air thick with the unspoken understanding that life as they knew it had changed forever. The priests, who had survived the massacre, were left to question the will of the gods. How could they reconcile the bloodshed with their faith? The rituals, once performed with such certainty, now felt hollow, the words of prayer catching in their throats. The gods had been silent in the face of the massacre, and the people were left to wonder if they had been abandoned. But even in their doubt, there was a growing resolve, a belief that the gods, though silent, would expect them to fight for their survival. The tension in the city grew with each passing day. The Spanish, aware of the growing hostility, fortified their positions, knowing that they were now surrounded by enemies. They had come to Tenochtitlan seeking wealth and glory, but now they were trapped in a city on the edge of rebellion. Cortés, still absent, had left them to navigate a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. As the days turned into weeks, the Aztec resistance began to take shape. The warriors, once held in check by Montezuma's cautious diplomacy, were now ready to fight. The people, united by their grief and their anger, were prepared to rise up against the invaders. The massacre had lit a fire in their hearts, a fire that could not be extinguished by fear or by the power of the Spanish. The city, though wounded, was not defeated. The spirit of Tenochtitlan was alive, burning with the fierce determination of a people who had been pushed too far. The aftermath of the massacre was more than just a time of mourning, it was a time of awakening. The Aztecs, once willing to tolerate the presence of the Spanish, were now resolved to reclaim their city, their land, their way of life. The tension that gripped Tenochtitlan was the prelude to a storm that would soon engulf the city in a struggle for survival. The massacre had set the stage for a battle that would decide the fate of the Aztec Empire, and the people of Tenochtitlan, though battered and bruised, were ready to fight. The city of Tenochtitlan, once vibrant and alive, was now a battleground shrouded in despair. The skies above, darkened by smoke, bore witness to the epic struggle between the Aztec warriors and the Spanish invaders. The walls of the city, which had once stood as symbols of power and prosperity, were now fortress defenses under siege. The clash was no longer just a conflict of armies, but a fight for survival, a battle that would determine the fate of an empire. The Aztec revolt had erupted like a storm, fierce and unrelenting. The streets, which had been filled with the echoes of daily life, were now alive with the sounds of battle. Warriors, driven by a mix of rage and desperation, surged through the city, their eyes blazing with determination. The Spanish, who had initially thought themselves secure within the city's walls, now found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making. From the moment the revolt began, the city was a scene of chaos. The Spanish, unprepared for the ferocity of the Aztec resistance, struggled to hold their ground. Makeshift barricades were hastily erected, and the Spanish soldiers fought to protect their positions as the Aztec forces pressed in from all sides. The once proud city, a beacon of Aztec civilization, had become a prison for the invaders. The strategic moves on both sides were a testament to the high stakes of the siege. The Aztecs, with their intimate knowledge of the city, used every advantage to their benefit. They cut off supply routes, targeted key locations, and employed tactics that made the Spanish realize just how vulnerable they were. The Aztecs had once fought with ceremonial fervor, now they fought with a grim, determined resolve. Their goal was clear: drive the Spanish out, reclaim their city, and restore their way of life. On the other side, the Spanish commanders, led by Cortés, had to adapt quickly to the changing circumstances. The initial confidence that had accompanied their conquest had been replaced by a palpable fear. The Aztec uprising had turned the city into a deadly trap, and the Spanish were forced to defend themselves against a relentless enemy. Their efforts to regroup and strategize were hampered by the constant pressure from the Aztec forces. They had underestimated the will of the people they had sought to subjugate, and now they were paying the price. Amid the turmoil, the fate of Montezuma, the once powerful emperor, unfolded in a tragic manner. The revolt had driven a wedge between him and his people. The emperor, who had once been the symbol of unity and strength, was now seen as a figure of betrayal. His decision to allow the Spanish into Tenochtitlan had led to the massacre at the Great Temple, and the ensuing rebellion had left him isolated and powerless. Montezuma's attempts to negotiate with the Aztecs to restore some semblance of order were met with scorn and anger. His people no longer saw him as their leader but as a collaborator with the invaders. The emperor, caught between the fury of his people and the demands of his Spanish captors, found himself in an impossible position. His authority had been shattered, and his attempts to mediate were seen as weak and ineffective. The collapse of the alliance, which had once seemed a glimmer of hope for peace, now lay in ruins. The bond that had briefly held the Spanish and Aztecs together was gone, replaced by mutual distrust and open hostility. The Spanish, who had once relied on Montezuma's cooperation, now faced an enemy that was resolute in its determination to drive them out. The Aztecs, fueled by their anger and desire for revenge, no longer saw the Spanish as mere intruders but as enemies who had to be defeated at all costs. Montezuma's fate was a poignant reminder of the cost of conflict. The emperor, who had once wielded immense power, was now a prisoner in his own palace, his fate sealed by the very people he had sought to lead. His tragic end came as the city he had once ruled was consumed by flames and chaos. The weight of his decisions, the massacre, and the rebellion had all culminated in his fall from grace. As the siege wore on, the suffering of the people of Tenochtitlan became ever more apparent. The once thriving city was now a place of desperation and despair. The streets, littered with the remnants of battle, were silent but for the occasional cry of anguish or the distant clatter of weapons. The people, who had once been filled with hope and pride, were now faced with the harsh reality of their situation. The siege of Tenochtitlan was a turning point in the conflict, a moment when the fate of the Aztec Empire hung in the balance. The struggle was not just a battle for control of the city but a fight for the survival of a culture and a way of life. The bravery and resilience of the Aztec warriors, the strategic acumen of both sides, and the tragic fate of Montezuma all converged to create a story of epic proportions, a story of conflict and loss that would be remembered for generations to come. The night was filled with an air of dread, a palpable fear that seemed to grip every corner of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish, who had once marched into the city with the confidence of conquerors, now faced their darkest hour. The plan to escape, born from desperation and a realization of their dire situation, was about to unfold in a scene of heart-wrenching chaos and suffering. As darkness descended upon the city, the Spanish forces prepared for their escape under a sky that seemed to mourn their plight. The streets, which had once echoed with the sounds of vibrant life, were now eerily silent except for the sounds of hurried footsteps and hushed voices. The narrow causeways that connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland were their only lifeline, but getting there would be fraught with danger. The Spanish soldiers, weighed down by the heavy armor and the treasures they had looted, moved through the city in a state of barely contained panic. The Aztec resistance had intensified, with warriors striking from every direction, their faces hidden behind masks of vengeance. The once unguarded routes were now heavily fortified by the Aztecs, turning the escape into a desperate gamble for survival. The night was thick with the sounds of battle, the clash of metal, the cries of the wounded, and the roar of the Aztec warriors. The Spanish attempted to move quickly, their hopes pinned on the idea that they could slip through the city's defenses under the cover of darkness. But the Aztecs were relentless, their fury unleashed after months of suffering and humiliation. They fought with a determination that seemed to turn every shadow into a potential threat. As the Spanish and their native allies made their way to the causeways, the night turned into a scene of utter despair. The narrow bridges over the lake were lined with defenders, making each step a treacherous journey. The Spanish soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, faced a torrent of arrows and attacks that seemed to come from all sides. Every advance was met with a counterattack, and every step forward felt like a step closer to disaster. The losses suffered by the Spanish were staggering. The once formidable force was now in disarray, their ranks thinning as they fought to keep the Aztecs at bay. The treasures they had carried with them, symbols of their conquests, were now lost in the chaos of their retreat. The weight of their greed, which had initially driven them forward, became a burden they could no longer bear. Their native allies, who had initially supported them, found themselves caught in the crossfire, their lives lost alongside their Spanish companions. The causeways, which had once been lifelines, became death traps. The narrow paths were choked with bodies, both Spanish and Aztec. The once proud banners of the Conquistadors were trampled underfoot, their symbols of power now lost in the mud and blood of their escape. The night was filled with the screams of the dying and the anguished cries of those who had survived, but were left to face the consequences of their choices. Amid the chaos, the Spanish soldiers struggled to maintain any semblance of order. The retreat was no longer a coordinated effort but a frantic scramble for survival. The once disciplined ranks were now broken, their formation scattered by the relentless attacks. The courage that had fueled their advance was replaced by a grim determination to escape with their lives. The Aztec warriors, driven by a thirst for revenge and a desire to reclaim their city, pressed on with unyielding resolve. Their victory was a bitter one, marred by the losses they had suffered and the destruction that had been wrought. Yet, in their eyes, the defeat of the Spanish was a triumph, a symbol of their resilience and strength in the face of overwhelming odds. As dawn approached, the city of Tenochtitlan lay in ruins, its people emerging from the night's chaos to survey the damage. The once great empire had been battered but not broken. The Aztecs, though exhausted and grieving, stood victorious over their fallen enemies. The Spanish, their hopes shattered and their forces decimated, were left to confront the bitter reality of their defeat. The Noche Triste, the sad night, would be remembered as a night of unimaginable suffering and loss. The Spanish retreat from Tenochtitlan was not just a military defeat but a profound and heartbreaking moment in history. The echoes of that night, the cries of the wounded, and the sorrow of those who had lost so much would linger long after the battle had ended. The city of Tenochtitlan, once a shining jewel of the Aztec Empire, was now a shadow of its former glory. The aftermath of the Noche Triste had left it battered and beleaguered, but the Aztec spirit remained unbroken. Yet, as the days passed, the reality of impending doom loomed over the city. The Spanish, though bruised and humbled, were not defeated. They had regrouped, gathered their strength, and were preparing for a final, decisive blow. The regrouping of Spanish forces marked a grim turning point. After the harrowing retreat, Cortés and his men had been forced to rethink their strategy. They had suffered significant losses, but their resolve was unshaken. The experience had only hardened their determination to conquer Tenochtitlan. Cortés, with renewed vigor, allied with indigenous groups that had previously been hostile, seeking to turn the tide in his favor. These new allies, driven by their own grievances against the Aztecs, added to the Spanish strength. The final siege began with an air of grim finality. The Spanish and their allies surrounded Tenochtitlan, cutting off the city from any hope of relief or escape. The once proud city, now a prisoner of its own grandeur, was encircled by a ring of steel and fire. The causeways, which had been the lifelines of the city, were now scenes of constant conflict. The Spanish forces, bolstered by their new allies, moved methodically, closing in on the heart of the Aztec capital. The Aztecs, despite their valiant efforts, found themselves struggling against the relentless siege. The Spanish had learned from their previous encounters, employing siege tactics with ruthless efficiency. The once strong defenses of Tenochtitlan were slowly being worn down. The city's inhabitants, already weakened by the earlier battles and the lack of resources, fought with a desperation born of knowing their world was collapsing around them. The walls that had stood for so long were breached, and the sacred spaces that had once been vibrant with life were now tainted with despair. Inside the city, the atmosphere was one of increasing desperation. The water supply, crucial for sustaining life, was cut off, and the food stores dwindled to nothing. The people of Tenochtitlan, who had once thrived in a land of plenty, were now facing starvation. The once bustling markets were silent, replaced by the hollow echoes of a city in collapse. Families huddled together, their faces etched with the pain of hunger and fear, as they tried to make sense of the devastation around them. As the Spanish forces pressed in, the final assault on Tenochtitlan was a scene of chaos and heartbreak. The city, once a beacon of Aztec culture and achievement, was now a battlefield strewn with the wreckage of its own glory. The Spanish, driven by their need to complete their conquest, fought with a fierce determination, while the Aztecs, fighting to protect their home, faced an enemy that was closing in from all sides. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not just a military defeat, but the end of an era. The Aztec Empire, which had been a powerful and thriving civilization, was reduced to ruins. The streets that had once been filled with the colors and sounds of life were now desolate. The temples, which had stood as symbols of faith and unity, were desecrated. The empire's rich cultural heritage, its art, its rituals, its very essence, was being dismantled before the eyes of its people. For the Aztecs, the implications of the fall were devastating. Their society, built on traditions and beliefs that had shaped their lives for centuries, was shattered. The conquerors, driven by their own goals and motivations, did not just defeat an enemy, they dismantled an entire way of life. The people of Tenochtitlan were left to face a future that was uncertain and bleak. Their once proud civilization, now under the control of foreign forces, was at the mercy of those who had come to their land as conquerors. The final moments of Tenochtitlan were filled with the sounds of sorrow and resignation. The Aztecs, though they fought with every ounce of strength they had left, saw their beloved city fall into the hands of the Spanish. The conquerors, having achieved their goal, looked upon the ruins of what had once been a symbol of greatness. The victory, though complete, was a hollow one, marked by the loss of a culture and the suffering of its people. As the dust settled over the once great city, the fall of Tenochtitlan was a moment of profound sadness and reflection. The end of the Aztec Empire was not just a historical event, but a reminder of the cost of conflict and the fragility of even the greatest of civilizations. The story of Tenochtitlan's fall was a tale of courage and tragedy, a testament to the enduring spirit of a people who faced their end with dignity even as their world crumbled around them. The Toxcatl Massacre was a pivotal moment that reverberated far beyond the blood-soaked stones of the Great Temple. It was a brutal act that not only marked a turning point in the conquest, but also left a deep scar on the soul of the Aztec Empire. The massacre was not just a single, horrific event, it was a harbinger of the suffering that would follow, shaping the fate of a civilization and influencing the course of history in ways that would echo for generations. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, the Spanish realized they had crossed a line that would change everything. The brutality of the event, the sheer scale of the bloodshed, had cemented their position as ruthless conquerors in the eyes of the Aztecs and the broader world. For the Spanish, it was a strategic move intended to crush resistance and assert dominance. But it also ignited a burning fury in the hearts of the Aztecs, a rage that fueled their resistance and shaped their struggle against the invaders. The impact on the Aztec culture and society was profound and devastating. The massacre shattered not just the physical space of the Great Temple, but the spiritual and cultural heart of the Aztec world. The priests, nobles, and people who had been slaughtered were not just individuals, they were symbols of the empire's strength and religious devotion. Their loss left a void that could not be filled, and the once proud rituals and ceremonies that defined Aztec life were forever altered. The people of Tenochtitlan, grappling with grief and anger, faced an uncertain future, their cultural practices and societal structures thrown into disarray. For the Aztecs, the massacre was a brutal awakening to the harsh realities of their situation. It transformed their resistance from a battle for survival into a desperate struggle to preserve their identity and dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. The Aztec warriors fought with a fierce, almost fanatical determination, driven by the memory of their fallen comrades and the desire to protect what remained of their world. The massacre became a rallying point, a symbol of the injustices they faced, and a driving force behind their relentless fight against the Spanish. From the Spanish perspective, the massacre was a calculated decision aimed at quelling the growing unrest and asserting control over a rebellious population. Yet, the brutality of the act also had unintended consequences. While it did temporarily suppress resistance, it also hardened the resolve of the Aztec people and fueled their determination to resist. The Spanish conquest, which had begun with a degree of cooperation and diplomacy, became increasingly characterized by violence and distrust. The massacre deepened the chasm between the two cultures, turning potential allies into bitter enemies and ensuring that the conquest would be a prolonged and bloody affair. Both Spanish and Aztec sources provide poignant reflections on the massacre, revealing the deep emotional and psychological impact it had on both sides. Spanish accounts often describe the event with a mix of detached calculation and justified brutality, reflecting a mindset that viewed the massacre as a necessary evil in the quest for conquest. These sources, while documenting the strategic motives behind the massacre, also reveal the horror and guilt that some Spanish observers felt about the scale of the violence. On the other hand, Aztec accounts of the massacre are filled with raw emotion and sorrow. They recount the massacre as a moment of profound loss, a turning point that marked the beginning of a period of intense suffering and oppression. The Great Temple, once a symbol of their cultural and spiritual strength, became a site of unimaginable tragedy. For the Aztecs, the massacre was not just a battle lost, but a symbol of the larger struggle against a relentless and dehumanizing force. The legacy of the Toxcatl Massacre is a stark reminder of the cost of conquest and the price of violence. It shaped the subsequent events of the Spanish conquest, turning a complex and multifaceted interaction between two cultures into a brutal and relentless conflict. The massacre's impact on Aztec culture and society was profound, altering their traditions and changing the course of their history. The different perspectives from Spanish and Aztec sources offer a glimpse into the deep emotional wounds inflicted by the massacre and the enduring scars left on both cultures. The Toxcatl Massacre stands as a powerful testament to the human cost of conflict and the enduring power of memory. It was a moment of unimaginable suffering that shaped the course of history and left an indelible mark on the legacy of both the Aztec Empire and the Spanish conquest. The echoes of that night, the grief of the survivors, and the weight of the choices made continue to resonate through the ages, a haunting reminder of the profound impact of such a tragic event. The night was thick with tension and desperation. For the Spanish conquistadors, the massacre at the Toxcatl Festival was not just a sudden act of violence, it was a decision steeped in fear, ambition, and the heavy weight of their own beliefs. The massacre was a defining moment that reflected the intense struggles within the Spanish minds and hearts as they grappled with their monumental task of conquering an empire. From the Spanish perspective, the rationale behind the massacre was driven by a complex mix of fear, religious zeal, and ruthless ambition. The conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, had witnessed the immense power and resilience of the Aztecs. Despite initial hopes for peaceful coexistence and alliances, the relationship between the two groups had soured. The Spanish had faced multiple threats and betrayals, and their sense of insecurity was heightened by the possibility of a large-scale uprising. In the chronicles and letters written by the Spanish themselves, there's a haunting echo of justification mingled with regret. These accounts often describe the massacre as a necessary evil, a grim but essential action taken to ensure their survival and dominance. The Spanish saw themselves as enacting a harsh but needed measure to preempt what they believed was an imminent and potentially devastating rebellion. They viewed the massacre as a way to demonstrate their strength and to break the will of the Aztec resistance. The letters and chronicles, penned by the likes of Cortés and his men, reveal a chilling mix of rationalization and cold calculation. Cortés, in his correspondences with the Spanish crown, often framed the massacre within the broader narrative of his mission. He spoke of his actions as strategic, a means to secure the foothold of his men in the heart of the Aztec Empire. The documents reflect a mindset where the brutality of the massacre was seen as an unfortunate but necessary step in the grand scheme of conquest. Religion played a significant role in shaping the actions and justifications of the Spanish. The conquistadors were deeply influenced by their Catholic faith, which, in their view, provided divine sanction for their actions. The Spanish saw themselves as instruments of God, bringing Christianity to what they perceived as a pagan world. The massacre was, in their distorted reasoning, not only a strategic maneuver but also a means to purge the land of what they saw as sinful practices. This religious fervor was both a shield and a spur, justifying their actions and driving them forward even in the face of profound moral and ethical dilemmas. Fear, too, was a powerful motivator. The Spanish were acutely aware of the fragile nature of their hold on the Aztec Empire. The constant threat of rebellion and the uncertainty of their position in a hostile land weighed heavily on their minds. The massacre was a drastic measure to assert control and to intimidate any potential dissenters. The sheer scale of the violence was meant to send a message: resistance was futile, and the consequences of defiance would be catastrophic. Ambition, intertwined with fear and faith, further fueled the Spanish decision. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was not merely a military campaign, it was a pursuit of glory and riches. The promise of wealth and power was a powerful incentive, driving the conquistadors to commit acts of extreme violence to secure their goals. The massacre was a dark reflection of the lengths they were willing to go to achieve their ambitions, sacrificing countless lives in the process. The accounts from the Spanish perspective are filled with a sense of grim justification and an unsettling detachment from the suffering they caused. The chronicles often narrate the events with a focus on the strategic benefits and the immediate impact, with less emphasis on the human cost. The brutality of the massacre is framed as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of their mission, a perspective that reveals the disturbing moral complexity of their actions. The massacre, through the eyes of the Spanish, was a coldly calculated act of dominance, driven by a mix of fear, religious fervor, and unrelenting ambition. The chronicles and letters that survive from this period provide a stark glimpse into the mindset of those who carried out the massacre, revealing a chilling rationalization for actions that led to unimaginable suffering. The emotional distance in these accounts reflects the harsh reality of conquest, where the cost of ambition and the weight of fear led to decisions that would forever alter the course of history. The night of the Toxcatl Massacre left a scar on the hearts of the Aztecs that would never heal. For the Aztecs, the massacre was not just a moment of brutal violence, it was a profound betrayal and a catastrophic blow to their cultural and spiritual world. The accounts from those who lived through it are filled with raw emotion and deep sorrow, painting a picture of a people reeling from the shock of an unimaginable loss. In the Aztec narrative, the massacre was described as a night of unimaginable horror. The Great Temple, a place of sacred rituals and divine connection, became a scene of slaughter. The people who had gathered there for the Toxcatl festival, a time of renewal and celebration, found themselves trapped in a nightmare. The massacre, as recounted by those who survived, was not just about the loss of lives, but about the destruction of a sacred space. The temple, once a symbol of their faith and strength, was desecrated in a way that struck at the very heart of Aztec spirituality. The cultural and spiritual ramifications of the massacre were profound. The Toxcatl festival was more than just a celebration, it was a crucial part of the Aztec religious calendar, a time when the gods were honored and the cosmic order was reaffirmed. The violent disruption of this sacred event was seen as a cosmic affront, a violation of the sacred order that left the Aztecs feeling abandoned by their gods. The massacre cast a dark shadow over their rituals, leaving the survivors with a sense of spiritual betrayal and a profound loss of faith in the protective powers they had once relied upon. The massacre also shattered the cultural unity of the Aztec people. The Great Temple was not just a physical space, but a symbol of their identity and strength. The destruction of this central pillar of their culture left the Aztecs in a state of disarray and despair. The collective memory of the massacre became a rallying point for resistance, a powerful symbol of the injustice and suffering they had endured. The stories of the massacre were passed down through generations, each retelling infused with the pain and anger of those who had lived through it. The narrative of betrayal and resistance that emerged from the massacre was deeply emotional and powerful. The Aztecs felt betrayed by the Spanish, who had initially presented themselves as potential allies. The sudden and brutal attack on their sacred festival was seen as the ultimate act of treachery. The memory of the massacre fueled a fierce resistance among the Aztecs, who saw the Spanish not just as conquerors but as violators of their sacred traditions and enemies of their very existence. The stories from the Aztec perspective are filled with vivid, emotional accounts of the massacre. Survivors spoke of the chaos and bloodshed, of the screams of the dying and the sight of their sacred spaces being desecrated. These accounts were not just historical records, but expressions of deep personal and collective grief. The massacre became a symbol of the larger struggle against oppression and a powerful motivator for continued resistance. In the wake of the massacre, the Aztecs' resolve to fight the Spanish became stronger. The event was a rallying cry, a source of unity and strength in the face of overwhelming adversity. The betrayal they had suffered fueled their determination to resist the Spanish invaders, turning their grief and anger into a powerful force for survival. The massacre was a dark chapter in their history, but it also became a symbol of their enduring spirit and their unwillingness to accept defeat. The accounts of the massacre from the Aztec perspective reveal the deep emotional impact of the event. The massacre was not just a strategic move by the Spanish, but a devastating blow to the heart of Aztec culture and spirituality. The stories of betrayal and resistance that emerged from this dark night are a testament to the strength and resilience of the Aztec people, who faced their suffering with a powerful mixture of sorrow and defiance. The Toxcatl Massacre, with its raw brutality and tragic aftermath, continues to be a powerful subject of reflection and debate. As the dust of history settles, the massacre's place in the broader narrative of Mexican identity and its modern interpretation reveal a complex and poignant legacy. The historical debate surrounding the Toxcatl Massacre is charged with emotion and controversy. Historians and scholars have grappled with the motivations behind the massacre, its impact on the Aztec Empire, and the broader implications for the Spanish conquest. Some argue that the massacre was a strategic move by the Spanish, driven by fear and ambition, while others view it as a brutal and unnecessary act of violence. The differing perspectives reflect deeper questions about the nature of conquest, the ethics of war, and the human cost of imperial ambitions. The debate is not just an academic exercise, but a reflection of the ongoing struggle to understand and come to terms with a painful chapter of history. For many, the Toxcatl Massacre holds a prominent place in Mexican history and identity. It is remembered as a defining moment in the struggle against Spanish colonialism, a symbol of the suffering endured by the Aztec people, and a testament to their resistance and resilience. The massacre has become a potent symbol of Mexican national identity, representing the struggle against oppression and the enduring spirit of a people who faced immense adversity. The event is woven into the national consciousness, serving as a reminder of the rich and complex history that shapes modern Mexico. Contemporary views and commemoration of the Toxcatl Massacre reflect a deep sense of reflection and remembrance. In Mexico, the massacre is remembered not just as a historical event, but as a moment of profound cultural and spiritual significance. Various commemorations and cultural expressions honor the memory of those who suffered and died, seeking to preserve the legacy of the Aztec people and their resistance. Museums, historical sites, and educational programs highlight the massacre's impact, providing a space for reflection and understanding. The ways in which the massacre is remembered and interpreted vary widely. Some see it as a symbol of the broader struggle against colonialism and oppression, while others view it as a poignant reminder of the cultural loss and suffering endured by the Aztec people. The event is often commemorated with ceremonies and events that emphasize the importance of preserving the memory of those who lived through it and the lessons that can be learned from their experiences. The Toxcatl Massacre's legacy is deeply embedded in Mexican cultural memory, shaping how the past is remembered and understood. It is a powerful reminder of the human cost of conquest and the resilience of those who faced it. Through reflection and commemoration, the massacre remains a living part of Mexico's history, a testament to the enduring strength and spirit of its people.